Meghan and Harry just attended the Kevin Costner event, but like it is with anything else they have been doing lately, it was a complete mess.
Night falls over Montecito, but inside the mansion, everything is unraveling. A single revelation from Kevin Costner has triggered a chain reaction no one saw coming. Meghan Markle now faces questions tied to a hidden connection, while Prince Harry is seen pacing, shaken, and silent. Was this exposure the result of buried pasts, powerful gatekeepers, or something far more strategic? Contracts are freezing, royal alarms are rising, and one decision could change everything forever. But what happens next could destroy them both in ways no one is prepared to face. When the door closed and everything changed. The atmosphere inside Santa Barbara shifted long before anyone said a word. What was meant to be another polished gathering along the California coastline carried all the familiar signs of prestige. Soft lighting reflected off glass walls, conversations moved in low, confident tones, and guests arrived with the quiet assurance that comes from belonging. But beneath that surface, something was already unsettled. Subtle changes began to appear. Pauses lingered longer than expected. Glances were exchanged without explanation. The rhythm of the room felt different, as though an invisible line had been drawn. At the center of that shift was Meghan Markle, whose expected presence had already been discussed in smaller circles before the event began. For years, access to spaces like this had followed a predictable pattern. Doors opened, invitations extended, introductions made. But this time, something had changed. The assumption of entry no longer held the same certainty. What had once been routine now required approval, and that approval was no longer guaranteed. The turning point came when Kevin Costner made his position unmistakably clear. Known for maintaining a careful balance between influence and discretion, his response did not rely on raised voices or dramatic gestures. It was measured, controlled, and delivered with a clarity that left no room for interpretation. He would not allow any association that could introduce controversy into his space. There was no hesitation in his tone, no attempt to soften the message. The decision stood on its own, firm and unchanging, and the effect was immediate. What followed was not loud, but it was powerful. In the same moment, a connection was raised, one that tied Meghan to a network that had already faced scrutiny in past public discussions. Details were not expanded upon, yet they did not need to be. The suggestion alone carried enough weight to alter the atmosphere completely. Conversations that had flowed easily began to stall. Expressions shifted from ease to caution. People who had been engaged moments earlier now appeared more distant, more measured in their responses. Within minutes, the impact extended beyond the walls of that gathering. Word moved quickly through Hollywood circles, where perception often shapes reality faster than confirmation ever could. Those who once maintained a neutral position began to reconsider. Invitations that might have been offered were quietly withheld. Collaborations that once seemed certain were now paused for further thought. The absence of direct statements did not lessen the effect. The silence itself became a signal. Back in Montecito, the consequences unfolded in real time. Prince Harry was reportedly caught in the middle of it as updates reached him. There was no prepared response, no strategy already in place to absorb the impact. Those close to the situation described a man moving through the space with growing urgency, trying to piece together what had just occurred. His words were brief, his tone unsettled. Calls were placed, messages sent, but clarity remained out of reach. This was not simply a moment of social discomfort or a temporary disruption. It marked the beginning of a deeper shift. The balance that had once supported their position, built on influence, access, and public perception, had changed within a single evening. What had felt stable now appeared uncertain. The door that once opened without resistance had closed, and the implications of that closure were already beginning to extend far beyond the event itself. This was not just a setback, but the moment everything shifted, influence fading, doors closing, and power slipping away in silence. But what hidden connection triggered this unraveling that now threatens everything they built? Let's find out. The connection that reshaped the narrative. What began as a single moment inside Santa Barbara did not stay contained for long. As the night's tension settled, attention quietly shifted backward in time, toward a connection that had remained largely unnoticed until now. The focus moved to a private gathering in the south of France, a high-level networking event attended by influential figures from across entertainment and business. Among those present were Kevin Costner and Meghan Markle. At the time, it had been just another exclusive setting, one of many where reputations are built and alliances quietly formed. Nothing about it appeared unusual. Nothing suggested that years later it would return with this kind of weight. Now, that moment was being re-examined through a very different lens. The significance did not come from the event itself, but from the company that surrounded it and the questions it raised. What had once blended into the background was now being pulled into focus, piece by piece. Small details that once seemed irrelevant were being revisited with new urgency. The connection, though not fully explained in public, carried enough weight to shift perception. And in an environment like Hollywood, perception alone can be enough to change everything. It does not require confirmation to influence decisions. It only requires doubt. Kevin Costner's role in this shift could not be ignored. He was not known for reacting impulsively or making careless statements. His reputation had been built over decades, not only through his work, but through the consistency of his public image. He had navigated an industry known for unpredictability with a steady presence that commanded respect. When someone with that level of standing chose to distance himself so clearly, it sent a message far beyond the walls of a single event. It signaled caution. It suggested that the situation was not one to be dismissed lightly. His silence before that moment made his stance even louder. The response across the industry followed a pattern that was both quiet and unmistakable. There were no dramatic announcements or public condemnations. Instead, there was silence. Invitations that might have been extended were no longer offered. Conversations that once moved easily became brief and guarded. Professional relationships began to shift without explanation. This was not a sudden collapse, but a gradual withdrawal, one that carried its own kind of force. Doors did not slam shut. They simply stopped opening. Within these circles, Meghan Markle's name began to take on a different meaning. It was no longer simply associated with influence or visibility. It was being evaluated through a new filter, one centered on risk. Decision-makers who once saw opportunity now saw uncertainty. Each potential collaboration required closer scrutiny. Each association carried new questions. Even neutral positions began to feel unsafe. The shift was subtle, but it was steady. Back in Montecito, this growing distance did not go unnoticed. Prince Harry remained at the center of a situation that was expanding beyond control. The shift was no longer about a single comment or a single event. It had evolved into something broader, something that moved through private conversations and internal decisions. What had started as a moment of refusal had now become a wider reassessment, and the consequences were beginning to reach far beyond the original exposure, shaping decisions that would define everything that followed. Back in Montecito, the distance grew, Harry trapped in a crisis spiraling beyond control, as quiet decisions reshaped everything. But what unseen force turned one refusal into a financial collapse that could change their future forever? Let's unravel the details. When the money started to slip away. As the quiet distancing within Hollywood continued to spread, the consequences began to move beyond reputation and into something far more tangible. Inside corporate offices from Los Angeles to major streaming headquarters, conversations were no longer centered on creative opportunities or future collaborations. They had shifted toward exposure, liability, and risk. What had started as a single moment of tension was now reaching into the financial foundations surrounding Meghan Markle, changing the way her entire portfolio was being viewed. Major agreements that once symbolized a new chapter of independence were suddenly placed under intense review. Executives who had previously approved these partnerships without hesitation began revisiting clauses that had long remained buried deep within complex contracts. These were not routine checks carried out for formality. They were structured, deliberate evaluations tied to one central concern: whether the ongoing situation could damage the global image and credibility of the companies involved. Within these agreements, one provision stood out more than any other: the morality clause. It had always existed in the background, rarely discussed in public or tested under pressure. But now it was being examined with careful attention, word by word, implication by implication. At the center of these reviews were high-value partnerships that had defined the Sussex brand's transition into the entertainment industry. Streaming deals, production arrangements, and content agreements were no longer seen as secure or guaranteed. Payments that had already been scheduled and approved were quietly paused, placed on hold while internal assessments continued. Financial teams approached the situation with caution, but their actions were decisive. Every move followed a process, and every process pointed in the same direction. Within professional circles, this shift unfolded without noise or spectacle. There were no dramatic public announcements, no immediate cancellations broadcast across headlines. Instead, there were internal memos passed between departments, urgent meetings held behind closed doors, and legal consultations that extended late into the night. Behind those closed doors, the same question repeated itself in different forms. Could these partnerships continue without creating long-term reputational damage? For Meghan Markle's team, the pressure became immediate and unavoidable. Advisors and representatives found themselves responding to a situation that was evolving faster than anticipated. Communication lines remained open at all hours as they sought clarity from partners, legal teams, and corporate decision-makers. The tone of those conversations reflected a growing urgency. What had once been a position of confidence and forward momentum now required careful defense and constant reassurance. At the same time, agencies connected to her work began conducting their own independent risk assessments. These were not symbolic exercises meant to reassure stakeholders. They were part of a broader system that determines which projects move forward and which ones are quietly withdrawn before reaching the public stage. The shift in tone across these evaluations was unmistakable. Confidence had given way to caution, and caution was beginning to influence decisions. Back in Montecito, the financial implications were beginning to take shape alongside the reputational shift. Prince Harry was no longer facing just a public relations challenge. The stability of the life they had built together was now being tested from within. What had started as a single moment of exposure had triggered a chain reaction that extended into contracts, delayed payments, and long-term plans that were now uncertain. The situation was no longer abstract or distant. It had become immediate, measurable, and increasingly difficult to control. Decisions were being made in real time, funds were being delayed without clear timelines, and the foundation that once appeared solid was beginning to show visible signs of strain, with each passing hour adding pressure to a system already under stress. Now in Montecito, financial strain deepens as reputations shift and foundations crack from within. Contracts falter, payments stall, and stability fades. But what really happened behind those closed doors that triggered this unraveling? Keep watching. Behind closed doors in Montecito, as financial pressure tightened and professional ties grew uncertain, the strain inside the Montecito residence became impossible to ignore. What had once appeared as a controlled and carefully managed environment now felt unsettled, almost fragile. The silence between conversations began to carry more weight than the words themselves, stretching longer, heavier, and harder to navigate. Even routine moments seemed altered, as though the atmosphere had shifted in a way that could no longer be managed through public statements or carefully crafted responses. At the center of it all were Prince Harry and Meghan Markle, now facing the same crisis from entirely different perspectives. For Meghan, the focus turned toward response and resistance. Reports indicated that her team had already begun exploring legal options, examining how the growing narrative could be challenged and contained. The approach was direct and deliberate. It reflected a clear intention to confront the situation head-on rather than step back from it. Inside her workspace, the pace of activity did not slow. Calls were made one after another. Documents were reviewed in detail. Strategies were discussed with increasing urgency as each new development added another layer of complexity. The tone surrounding these efforts carried both frustration and determination. From her position, this was not simply a matter of perception. It was a situation that demanded action, something to be addressed through structure, legal precision, and control. Harry's response unfolded along a different path. While the external situation continued to escalate, those within the environment began to notice a shift in his behavior. He remained present, but there was a distance that had not been there before. His movements around the property became quieter, more measured. He spent more time alone, often walking through spaces without engaging, as though deep in thought. Conversations that once carried ease and familiarity now felt shorter, more cautious, and at times incomplete. There was a growing sense that he was processing the situation internally, weighing possibilities that extended far beyond the immediate moment. Each development seemed to push him further into reflection, rather than reaction. His focus appeared less on controlling the narrative and more on understanding what the situation meant for the future. The difference in approach began to reshape the dynamic between them. Meghan moved forward with action, seeking to regain control through legal and professional means. Harry, in contrast, appeared to be stepping back, observing the consequences as they unfolded. It was not a sudden separation, but a gradual shift in alignment. The unity that had once defined their public image now showed signs of strain behind closed doors. This shift did not exist in isolation. It was the result of everything that had already taken place. The exposure, the distancing within Hollywood, and the growing financial uncertainty all contributed to the pressure building inside the home. Each new development added weight, and that weight began to surface in subtle but meaningful ways. Moments that might once have passed unnoticed now carried significance. A delayed response during a conversation. A pause where there would have once been agreement. Decisions that were no longer made together without hesitation. These details, small on their own, began to form a larger pattern that pointed toward an emerging divide. Within Montecito, the situation had clearly moved beyond external perception or professional consequences. It had entered a more personal space, where the balance between two individuals facing the same crisis was beginning to shift. And as that shift became more visible, it suggested a change that would not be easily reversed. Inside Montecito, perception turned personal, alliances began shifting, and distance quietly grew between two lives once aligned. But as London began to respond, was this the moment everything fractured beyond repair and control? Stay tuned. London begins to respond. As the strain inside Montecito continued to grow, attention quietly shifted across the Atlantic to London, where the situation was being viewed through a far more structured and consequential lens. What had begun as a Hollywood controversy was no longer confined to industry perception or public reaction. It was now entering a space shaped by tradition, legal authority, and the long-standing responsibility of protecting the institution of the monarchy. Within the palace walls, the tone of discussion had changed. This was no longer about headlines or speculation. It had moved into the realm of constitutional duty. Advisors close to King Charles III were reportedly following developments with increasing urgency. Reports emerging from California, combined with the visible distancing from corporate partners and influential figures, had triggered deeper concerns. The question being asked was no longer limited to reputation. It was broader and more serious. Could this situation, if allowed to escalate, begin to affect the standing and credibility of the monarchy itself? This was not treated as a distant possibility. It was being approached as a real and immediate risk. At the center of these internal evaluations was a legal instrument that had existed for more than a century, the Titles Deprivation Act, 1917. For years, it had remained largely symbolic, referenced in discussions of history rather than current strategy. Now it was being brought back into focus with renewed attention. The structure it provided was clear and direct. In cases where actions were judged to be harmful to the interests of the Crown, titles could be reviewed and, if necessary, withdrawn. What once seemed distant was now being considered as a practical option. Within advisory circles, the approach remained careful and methodical. Each development coming out of California was examined alongside its potential impact on the institution as a whole. This was not about reacting to pressure or responding emotionally. It was about understanding how the situation could influence diplomatic relationships, public trust, and the long-term stability of the monarchy. The language used in these discussions reflected caution, but it also carried a sense of readiness. If a line was crossed, there would be a response. The concern extended beyond any single individual. It centered on the broader image of the royal family and the need to shield it from association with ongoing controversy. The monarchy functions within a framework where credibility is essential. Public confidence, international perception, and institutional stability are closely connected. Any disruption to that balance is taken seriously, especially when it begins to draw global attention. As these conversations continued, the divide between Montecito and London became increasingly clear. Actions taken in one place were now shaping decisions in the other. Prince Harry remained positioned between both worlds, yet the pull from each side was growing stronger and more difficult to reconcile. The situation had moved far beyond the boundaries of entertainment or personal life. It had entered a space where governance, tradition, and legal authority intersected. The shift was not loud or immediate, but it was undeniable. And within that shift, the direction of what might come next was beginning to take form. The crisis moved beyond fame into power, law, and royal survival itself. But was this quiet shift toward the exit a strategic retreat or the first sign of a much deeper fracture that cannot be undone? Stay with us. A quiet shift toward the exit. As discussions in London grew more focused and the pressure inside Montecito continued to build, a subtle but meaningful change began to take shape around Prince Harry. It did not arrive with public statements or sudden announcements. Instead, it revealed itself gradually, through his movements, his choices, and the spaces he began to occupy on his own. The shift was quiet, almost easy to miss at first, but once noticed, it became impossible to ignore. Recent appearances offered a clearer glimpse into this transformation. During solo engagements, his demeanor appeared more composed, yet noticeably distant. The energy was different from the earlier joint appearances that once defined his public role. Observers noted a quieter presence, a more reflective posture. His expressions carried less urgency, more restraint. Conversations seemed measured, interactions focused. There was a growing sense that his attention had turned inward, as though he was no longer reacting to events, but carefully weighing each step before taking it. Behind the scenes, reports pointed toward renewed communication with King Charles III. These exchanges were described as private and direct, bypassing the usual channels that typically manage royal contact. That detail alone suggested significance. The nature of these conversations was not publicly disclosed, but their purpose appeared increasingly clear. They indicated an attempt to reopen a line that had once been distant, perhaps even closed. It was not framed as reconciliation, but rather as a necessary dialogue in a moment of mounting pressure. Within this evolving situation, a new narrative quietly began to take shape. It was not announced or confirmed, yet it could be traced through the sequence of actions unfolding over time. The idea of a possible return, once considered unlikely, was now being discussed with greater seriousness. Those familiar with the situation described it not as a final decision, but as a path being explored. Even so, the direction of that path was becoming harder to dismiss with each passing day. This shift also revealed a growing difference in approach. While Meghan Markle remained focused on addressing external pressures through structured responses and legal positioning, Harry appeared to be considering a different kind of resolution. His focus seemed less centered on confrontation and more aligned with repositioning. It was not about reacting to what had happened, but about determining what could still be controlled moving forward. The preparation for what might come next did not unfold in public view. It moved quietly, through conversations held out of sight, arrangements made without announcement, and timing that appeared deliberate. Each step seemed carefully considered, suggesting that the situation had reached a point where long-term consequences were guiding immediate decisions. Nothing felt rushed, yet nothing felt accidental. This was not a dramatic departure or a sudden break. It was a controlled movement, shaped by reflection and necessity. The environment around him continued to shift, and his response followed that change with equal precision. The direction was becoming clearer, even as the final decision remained unspoken. This was no sudden break, but a calculated retreat shaped by pressure and precision. Yet as everything aligned around him, one question lingered about what he truly chose when the divide finally became reality. Keep watching. The moment the divide became reality. By the time the final hours approached, the pressure surrounding Montecito had reached a level that could no longer be contained. What had been building across Hollywood, corporate offices, and royal corridors now converged into a single, unavoidable reality. The financial strain that began quietly was now intensifying with clarity. Reviews had turned into action. Delays had turned into restrictions. Access to funds and ongoing projects faced increasing uncertainty, creating a sense that the foundation itself was no longer stable. Within this tightening environment, the legal dimension grew sharper. On one side, efforts connected to Meghan Markle continued to take shape, focusing on challenging the narrative and protecting what remained of her professional standing. The strategy reflected determination and resistance, with legal avenues being explored as a means to push back against the growing isolation. On the other side, developments in London moved with a different kind of authority. Discussions that had once been cautious now carried greater weight, shaped by the potential use of established legal mechanisms tied to royal accountability. At the center of this convergence stood Prince Harry, facing a decision that could no longer be delayed. The distance between the two paths before him had become impossible to ignore. One direction kept him within the life he had built in California, alongside ongoing legal battles and financial uncertainty. The other pointed back toward the structured environment of the monarchy, where expectations were clear, but the personal cost was equally significant. Inside Montecito, the atmosphere reflected this turning point. The tension that had once moved quietly beneath the surface now carried a visible weight. Conversations became more direct, pauses more deliberate. Each moment seemed to lead toward a conclusion that neither side could fully avoid. The difference in approach that had been growing over time now stood fully formed, shaping the outcome in ways that could not be reversed. As events continued to unfold, the direction of movement became clearer through action rather than words. Harry's earlier shift, marked by distance and reflection, now aligned with a decision that was taking shape in real time. The preparation that had been quiet and measured began to translate into movement. The focus was no longer on managing perception or stabilizing the present. It had shifted toward determining what came next. The image that emerged was simple, yet heavy with meaning. A departure not defined by noise or public declaration, but by choice. The separation was not only physical, it represented a break in alignment, a moment where two paths that once moved together began to move apart. Meghan remained positioned within the world she had been navigating, facing the consequences as they continued to develop. Harry moved in a different direction, guided by a decision shaped over time rather than in a single instant. What had once been presented as a unified journey now stood divided. The sequence of events that began with a single moment of exposure had unfolded into something far larger, touching reputation, finance, and identity. And within that unfolding, a clear fracture had formed, marking a turning point that would define everything that followed. So, what do you think? Was Harry's quiet exit a rescue from collapse, or the moment everything truly unraveled for Meghan's empire and royal future? We'd like to hear your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe.